Привет, товарищ! Today we're going to talk about communism. Before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe, and also go check out my website, mrstockford.com. I'm posting a lot of really entertaining, easy to understand articles there, which I'm intending both for public use and for classroom materials. I can make those and churn those out way faster than I can make these videos. So please, check it out, and let's get started. What do you think about when you hear the word communism? Maybe something like this? Or maybe something like that? So in this video, I'd like to talk about how Karl Marx defined communism, how he created communism, how he and Engels worked to come up with this idea of what communism is, and kind of place it in the context of the time period that it was made. Typically, when people hear the word communism, one of three possible reactions runs through their head. First, you might think of some utopia where everybody's needs are met, there's no money, there's no need for government, and everyone just kind of works for the betterment of mankind and the betterment of each other. Second, you could think something like, oh, communism. I know all about that. It's that dictator thing in China and Russia and North Korea and Rocky IV, and it's killed all those millions and millions of people. Or your third, you have no idea what communism is. All of these are wrong. There are a lot of different definitions of communism that we could use to discuss this academically, but I really prefer Encyclopedia Britannica's definition, which says, communism is a political and economic system that seeks to create a classless society in which the major means of production, such as mines and factories, are owned and controlled by the public. There is no government or private property or currency, and the wealth is divided among citizens equally or according to individual need. Now that's a lot of words, and it may not actually have helped you understand communism at all, but lucky for you, I'm a history teacher. So the first part says that communism is a political and economic system which seeks to create a classless society. Now when I say classless society, I don't mean like without tact or not classy. What I mean is there's no social classes. There's no rich, no poor, no elite, no inferior, no slaves, no masters, things like that. There is no difference between people at the top of the food chain and the bottom of the food chain because there is no food chain. It's more like a food plateau. And a system based in communism would use government and money systems, so political and economics, to create this classless society. Marx and Lenin, rather than saying rich or poor, superior, inferior, they preferred the terms bourgeoisie and proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the really rich upper class people, the proletariat are the majority of people who are everybody else. And both Marx and Lenin really fought to have a proletariat that was in control of their own lives. In fact, that is one of the main tenets of communism, is that you bring everyone into the proletariat instead of having multiple classes, of which the proletariat is the biggest one with the least amount of power or economic influence. Okay, so the next part says, in which the major means of production, such as mines and factories, are owned and controlled by the public. Now, in the conventional system you're pretty familiar with, private individuals or private parties, businesses, might own other businesses or factories or these resources which produce goods that we all use. For example, Twitter is currently in the process of being purchased by Elon Musk. He is a private individual who would own this company and use this company to pay all of the people who work there. Ford is a company that is publicly owned and traded on the stock market, but run by businessmen, and as a company owns and operates all of the factories, cars, everything that it uses to produce all those resources, all those materials. It owns that and employs people to work in these factories to make the cars for us. Now, in the communist system, they're not run or owned by businessmen or individual private parties. They are instead owned by the people who work there. You work for Ford? No, Ford works for you. You own the factory. Ford has the privilege of using the products that you make for a fee. It's kind of confusing for us to think about if you haven't grown up with that system. In other words, everyone capable of producing owns the market, owns the factories, owns the machines. They own the means of production, and that's very key because Marx brings that up a lot. The means of production, the ways and materials and places in which things are made or produced so that they can be sold. One of the key ideals of Marx's communism is to fight against greedy capitalist owners. Think of Oliver Twist.
Please, sir,
May I have some more? Or anything in Les Mis, where people are just downtrodden and treated terribly by the business owners for no reason. These people who own the factories take all of the money and then leave everyone else out to dry, paying them these tiny little fees. And in the historical context of the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing and communism was first being theorized and made up by Marx and Engels, this was a hot topic. People were mad at these business owners. Marx's communism urged the factory workers to revolt and take the factory for themselves and start selling what they produce themselves instead of turning it over to the business, which then sells it commercially. Okay, so the next part of this definition, because we are still going through this definition, there is no government or private property or currency. Now this is where it starts getting a little sticky. You see, every attempt at communism that has been remotely successful, and I mean every attempt, has gone in the opposite direction of this. In fact, they tend to end with a stronger, more dictatorial government than when they started. And it's usually ruled by a very strong, small elite class. And this is why a lot of people will argue that true communism has never been tried, because communism says there's no need for government, no need for class, but in practice it has always led to a strong government with a very strong class. Next part of the definition, and the wealth is divided among citizens equally or according to individual need. Now this is a common platform among the American political left, especially politicians and fans of politicians like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'm not going to sit here and say whether or not they are good politicians or have good stances. I'm not going to get political here. But this whole spread the wealth thing has been said a lot in the American left for the last several years. But the difference is Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez and the American left tend to say spread the wealth literally meaning money, whereas Marx tends to refer to it more meaning money, food, shelter, goods, commodities, anything you need to live. It can also mean access to resources and things of value. You see, in a communist system, you only get what you need. In other words, a family of 5 would need a bigger house and a bigger car than a family of 3. And so the family of 5 gets the bigger house, the bigger car, and the family of 3 gets a smaller house and a smaller car. And that doesn't sound too bad if we're being honest. Okay, so now that we've got a working definition and understanding of what communism is supposed to be, let's talk about Marx and Engels themselves. Now, Marx and Engels were 2 like-minded Germans who happened to meet at a cafe in Paris. What are the odds? Now, they were 2 socialists. Let's take a second and define the term socialism. Socialism is a foundational principle of communism. In fact, it was seen by Marx as the forerunner of communism. That being said, while communism can date itself mostly to Marx and Engels, there are some similar theories that go back a bit further, but communism as we know it is with Marx and Engels in the 1800s. Socialism can be traced back all the way to the 3rd century BCE. And it differs from communism in one key area. Communism gives people control over the market with no government. Socialism gives the government complete control over the market and tries to work it in the favor of the people. So Marx and Engels, 2 German socialists, they meet at a cafe in Paris by happenstance and they immediately hit it off. In fact, they became lifelong friends. They were such good friends, in fact, that Engels basically had Marx move in with him and paid all of his bills until the day Marx died. Now, this brings up one of the many hypocrisies that we should point out about Marx and Engels. You see, Marx himself was a political activist and a writer, but otherwise did not work and was mostly unemployed because of his political activism. Most people didn't agree with him, so they fired him. And because he got fired so much and he refused to back down on some of his radical beliefs, it was very difficult for him to hold down a job, and he found himself unemployed for the majority of his life and only stayed out of homelessness because of his family and friends' generosity. Engels, on the other hand, was a very successful businessman, and while he was critical of capitalism and its flaws, that did not stop him from taking advantage of it. In fact, he did business in a very capitalist way. Engels actually was a factory owner who took all the money for himself, paying his employees very little, all while pointing a finger at people and saying, how dare they pay people very little while owning a factory. Anyway, back to my silk robe while I drink tea. So to break it down, you've got Marx and Engels, the founders of communism, one of whom refuses to work while saying everybody basically needs to work just to better society, and the other who is criticizing capitalists while being a capitalist, saying that the workers need to own everything and we shouldn't be making money off of the backs of workers while making money off of the backs of workers. To sum up, the founders of communism, a system where everyone has a job and the working class is in control, consisted of a writer who could not get or maintain a job and a businessman who controlled the working class. There's no way there could be any flaws in their ideas. Now, together the two created a number of political and philosophical works which they published themselves. Most of these had to do with the working class and how to improve working class lives. Now, their most notable work is the Communist Manifesto. This pamphlet, and yes, it is really only a pamphlet, examined the history and struggles of the social classes throughout history, at least up to the present day that it was published, right? It obviously hasn't covered through today. That would be weird. But it analyzed the then modern day struggles of the workers and posed some ways that their issues could be solved. But it also rightly argued that the workers were being deliberately kept down so that the elite could stay on top. And that is a pretty well-accepted historical fact and one of the main critiques of early-stage capitalism. So the Communist Manifesto itself is seen as one of the great defining works of communism because it outlines Marx and Engels' ideas very clearly. It also describes the national progression of economics from a capitalist system with little to no government involvement all the way up to a communist system with little to no government at all. And in the middle there, you of course have socialism with a very strong government working for the benefit of the people. And of course the government in a capitalist system has little to no control over the market. The government in a communist system barely exists, and the government in a socialist system has almost complete control over the market. Again, the idea is they are benevolently working for the people. Now, the manifesto is broken up into a preamble and 4 main sections. The preamble basically just claims that there's some alliance among all these European powers to try and suppress communism. And so if you haven't heard about communism, it's probably your government's fault. Now, the first section argues that all of history's struggles are really class struggles. Upper class versus lower class. It also includes many examples of these struggles, but instead of keeping it how we would normally explain it in history, it reframes it as bourgeoisie versus proletariat. And you'll remember from earlier in the video, bourgeoisie are the rich, proletariat are the poor. Now the second section sets up a strong positive relationship between the proletariat and the communists. Hey, you working class people, we're on your side. We're the ones who got your back, not anybody else, it's us. The third section is made to distinguish communism from socialism. It also dismisses other theories which are just calling for reforms but not calling for action, because the purpose of the Communist Manifesto is to call for a revolution, and so anything short of a revolution is not enough in Marx and Engels' eyes. And that brings us to the fourth section, which is the call to action. It explicitly calls for a revolution of the working class against the bourgeoisie. In fact, the manifesto ends with these words: "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." We have explained what communism is. We have placed it in historical context. We have talked about how it was theorized by Marx and Engels. Let's talk about the pros and cons of communism. Communism doesn't seem so bad. And this is coming from someone who would describe himself as a pretty staunch capitalist. You see, in communism, everyone's needs are taken care of. Everyone is helping each other, and true equality exists. It's hard to argue that any of those qualities are bad. No one's going hungry. No one's going homeless. No one is unclothed. How is that bad? On top of that, it has a great appeal to the working class. You see, factory workers who were frustrated that they were stuck in borderline poverty, or straight up stuck in poverty, while the owners are living like kings, are drawn to the promises of communism. They're drawn to the promises of owning what they produce instead of the foreman, instead of the owner. I'll be honest, it is indeed true. As we've defined it, true Marxist communism has never been tried. Only corrupted versions of communism have actually been implemented. Corrupted to the point where you could easily argue they're not even really communism. Now, taking it a step further, communism promises what capitalism can't: equality. Capitalism depends on the existence of an upper, middle, and lower class. There have to be rich, there have to be poor in a capitalist society. There have to be workers, there have to be administrators, there have to be leaders, there have to be led. But with all of these great promises, it almost sounds too good to be true. I would argue that true communism has never been tried because true communism can never be tried. You see, people are inherently selfish. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty, the majority of people will do what is best for themselves. Communism ignores this. Communism wants everyone to work for the best interests of each other, thereby eliminating any need for government, any need for property, any need for money, etc. Capitalism, on the other hand, embraces this selfishness and takes advantage of it. And you can use government to regulate selfishness. Now, both of these have very clear, distinct problems, but capitalism is at least implementable. With all of these great things that communism promises, it only takes one person to bring it all crumbling down. One person taking advantage of the system will lead to other people taking advantage of the system. One person who decides, I'm not gonna work, my needs are getting taken care of, why do I need to do this? And next thing you know, you have enough people being a drag on society that there's not enough being produced for everybody's needs to be met. And because of that, most communist societies have needed a strong government to regulate and enforce these ideas of working for society and the betterment of each other, and to eliminate as much of this laziness as possible, fostering instead a cult of personality and a cult of loyalty, instead of encouraging people to work so that they themselves can have their own selfish needs met. One final word. I believe there are two types of communism. The first is what I like to call Star Trek: The Next Generation communism, and the next is what I like to call real-world communism. We'll start with Star Trek communism, one episode where Jean-Luc Picard is explaining to someone how their society works. Picard described his society as one where people work for the betterment of each other. They worked to improve themselves. There wasn't any money, but there was a sort of government to enforce laws. And this government was a republic called the United Federation of Planets. Now, you see, this system could work. It meets the needs of everyone, it promotes true equality, it gets rid of money, and it ticks a lot of the boxes that true communism really wants you to tick. However, you have a strong government in place to stop people from taking advantage of the system. That being said, the government would need to stay free of corruption. Any corruption in this system would quickly spread and would quickly ruin it. And this would lead to terrible consequences later on. And honestly, that's what happened with real-world capitalism. Now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks realized that a strong government was necessary to enforce these issues. They knew that Marx's vision was flawed, and so they altered it to meet their needs. And that's why I would say it's not true that communism has never been implemented. It has been adapted, and it has been corrupted, but it's still communism. The goals were the same. The method was just tweaked to make it possible. That being said, it's also more synonymous with socialism, but again, topic for a different time. Now, for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this meant that there was a strong, elite upper class, which was better educated, better able to lead, whatever excuse you'll take. I suggest reading Animal Farm and examining the pig's reasons. It's pretty accurate. In an effort to destroy the bourgeoisie, they simply created a new bourgeoisie. Now, this was not significant only of Lenin. It was perpetuated by Stalin and basically every other Soviet leader from that point on. And this is the kind of system that has been adopted by basically every communist society since then, because really it's the only way to actually make it work. Now, I should mention really quickly that Lenin's system of communism did meet a lot of needs and make a lot of improvements. Under Lenin, Russians became very literate. Access to medical care greatly increased, access to food greatly increased, and many more truly positive improvements were made, but at the significant cost of creating a government ruled by an absolute dictator, which is only going to attract people who largely will abuse that power, like Stalin. And so what this means is really there are not just two kinds of communism, but there's even two kinds of real-world communism, the theoretical and the practical. You see, in theory, communism can work without any governing body. In practice, it either needs a dictator or strong government system to function, or will default to one slowly over a period of time. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. If you have any more questions, or if you'd like to read, please, once again, go visit my website, mrstockford.com. I'd really appreciate it, and please remember to let me know what you think in the comments. I thrive on feedback. Thank you, and goodbye.